There was a workshop somewhere in New England, where sawdust settled like snow and the smell of fresh-cut wood drifted through the air like something almost holy. A place where millions of Americans spent their weekend mornings, coffee warming their hands, completely hypnotized by a man in a flannel shirt who made the impossible look effortless. For over 2 decades, that workshop felt permanent. It felt like it would always be there waiting for you. Saturday morning, public television, Norm Abram, the low hum of a router. Wood shavings curling off a perfectly guided plane like ribbons of gold. It was a ritual for an entire generation of Americans, and it felt like it could never end. And then, without warning, it did. No dramatic farewell tour. No tearful final episode filled with standing ovations and emotional tributes. No grand announcement that the curtain was finally coming down. Just quietly one Saturday the workshop went dark, and it stayed dark. People noticed immediately. Oh, they noticed. Fan letters poured into the station. Online forums lit up with confusion and grief. Woodworkers across the country, people who had learned everything they knew from that screen, who had built dining room tables and bookshelves and children's beds using skills they had absorbed from this one calm, steady man. They all found themselves asking the same bewildered question. Why did it end? The official explanations that trickled out were polite, careful, the kind of answers that feel specifically designed to leave you with more questions than you started with. But the real story, the complete and genuinely human truth behind why one of public television's most beloved and longest-running programs simply stopped, is far more layered, far more personal, and far more surprising than most people ever had the chance to understand. This is the real story of Norm Abram, the new Yankee workshop, and the truth that was always hiding just beneath the sawdust. Norm Abram was never supposed to be a television star. That part is important to understand before anything else. He wasn't an entertainer who happened to know his way around a workshop. He was a craftsman, a builder, a man whose hands had developed the kind of knowledge that can't be taught in any classroom. He could feel the difference between oak and cherry without looking. He could spot an out-of-square joint from across a room. He was the kind of person who belonged in workshops, not on camera, and that distinction would turn out to be the very thing that made him extraordinary on screen. And yet, somehow, against all reasonable expectation, he became one of the most recognized and genuinely beloved figures in the history of American television. Not through drama. Not through controversy or scandal or a carefully constructed public image, but simply by being exactly, completely, and honestly himself, every single episode, without exception. That authenticity, that rare and almost old-fashioned quality of simply being real in front of an audience, is precisely what makes his story worth telling. And it's what makes the story of how that workshop went quiet so deeply worth understanding. Long before any camera ever found its way into his life, Norm Abram was just a young man from Massachusetts who loved to build things. Not casually, not as a weekend distraction. He loved it the way some people love music, with his whole self. He grew up watching his father work with wood. In their household, woodworking wasn't a hobby you picked up and set down. It was a language, a way of thinking and communicating that passed between generations without needing to be spoken out loud. His father could walk into any room, study a piece of furniture with quiet attention, and understand it the way a musician understands a song, hearing things in it that most people simply couldn't. And young Norm absorbed all of it. He absorbed the patience, the deep precision, the particular satisfaction that comes from taking raw, rough material and transforming it into something that will outlast you, that will still be standing in rooms you'll never see. When he went to college, he studied engineering, and that choice told you something essential about the way his mind worked. He didn't just want to build things beautifully, he wanted to understand why they worked. The physics concealed inside a perfectly cut dovetail joint, the geometry hidden within a tapered leg. He approached woodworking the way a scientist approaches a question, with genuine curiosity and methodical rigor, but also with something that science alone can never provide: an artist's instinct for the precise moment when something simply feels right. After graduating, he went to work in construction and renovation. Real work, hard and unglamorous and deeply instructive. The kind of work that leaves permanent calluses and teaches you things no classroom ever could. He built a reputation across the Boston area as someone who was extraordinarily good at his craft. Not loud about it, not seeking recognition for it, just quietly and consistently, undeniably excellent. And that quiet excellence was exactly what caught the attention of a producer named Russell Moresh. Moresh was already something of a legend within public television. He had worked alongside Julia Child in the early years of instructional television. And through that experience, he had developed an understanding that most television executives of his era simply didn't possess. He knew that audiences weren't just hungry for information, they were hungry for authenticity. That watching a genuine master at work, someone who wasn't performing competence but actually living it from the inside out, was genuinely riveting television in a way that polished entertainment could never fully replicate. Moresh had already built this old house into a phenomenon, a renovation series drawing audiences that nobody in public television had dared to predict. But he needed someone to anchor the carpentry segments. Someone with real skill who could work on camera without losing the naturalness, the unguarded quality that made them worth watching in the first place. When Norm Abram walked onto that set, something clicked into place immediately. He wasn't performing. He wasn't explaining things for the camera in that inflated, slightly condescending way that instructional television personalities so often fell into. He was simply working and talking while he worked the way a master craftsman talks to an apprentice standing at his elbow, direct, patient, completely without pretense. The audience felt it before anyone could fully explain it. Letters began arriving at the station. People wanted more of the quiet carpenter who spoke to them like they were capable of actually learning something. And somewhere in that response, a new idea began to take shape. But what came next was something even Norm himself likely never fully imagined. The new Yankee workshop arrived on public television and did something almost immediately that nobody had quite predicted. It built a community. Not in the manufactured, algorithm-driven way that media builds audiences today. Not through controversy or viral moments or carefully engineered drama. It built its community the old way, the slow way, the only way that actually lasts, through trust. Week after week, Norm Abram walked into that workshop, put on his safety glasses, picked up his tools, and built something extraordinary while making it feel genuinely and without condescension, entirely achievable. The format was deceptively humble. Each episode revolved around a single project, a shaker side table, a blanket chest with hand-cut joinery, a full set of kitchen cabinets. A rocking chair with carved details precise enough to make a museum curator stop and look twice. Norm moved through the entire process from beginning to end, from selecting the lumber at the start to applying the final finish coat at the close. No shortcuts, no skipping the difficult moments. Every joint explained, every measurement walked through, every tool choice discussed with the patience of someone who genuinely needed you to understand, not just watch. And people did far more than watch, they built. All across the country, in garages and basements and backyard sheds that smelled permanently of linseed oil and sawdust. Americans who had never once picked up a hand chisel began building furniture. Real furniture, they ordered the companion books that accompanied each season. They joined woodworking clubs that existed specifically to connect people who shared a Saturday morning ritual around the same television program. They wrote letters, actual handwritten letters on actual paper, describing the pieces they had completed. A dining table built for a daughter's first apartment. A blanket chest given as a wedding gift. A toy chest made for a grandchild who would grow up not knowing where it came from, only that it had always been there. This was the true breakthrough, not a single dramatic moment that could be pointed to and celebrated, but a slow and steady accumulation of trust and connection that quietly transformed a carpentry program into something genuinely cultural. Something that mattered in ways that had nothing to do with ratings or demographics. But beneath all that warmth, beneath all that sawdust and Saturday morning comfort, something else was happening. Something that would eventually matter in ways nobody was fully ready to reckon with. Television was changing. Public television was changing. The economics of producing serious programming were shifting beneath everyone's feet in ways that were difficult to see clearly in the moment, but that everyone could feel in their bones. The new Yankee workshop had grown beyond a show. It had become a franchise, a brand. A publishing enterprise with companion volumes and plan sets, and licensing arrangements that extended far beyond anything its earliest seasons could have anticipated. And carrying all of that, while simultaneously being the creative heart and the irreplaceable engine of the work itself, was a weight that only grew heavier with every passing season. For the moment, though, the show was at its absolute peak. And Norm Abram, the quiet craftsman from Massachusetts who had never set out to be famous, had become something genuinely rare in American media. A beloved public figure about whom virtually no one had anything unkind to say. A man who had earned loyalty without ever demanding it. But that very quality, that genuine and unperformed decency, was about to become both his greatest asset and in ways that were impossible to foresee. Part of what made the ending so quietly complicated. There is something almost mythological, looking back now, about what the new Yankee workshop became at the height of its run. Saturday morning public television had a particular rhythm in American households during those years. You woke up early, you made coffee. And if you were a certain kind of person, a maker, a builder, someone who found something close to meditation in the act of creating a physical thing with your hands, you turned on the television and there was Norm. The workshop filled with warm, steady light, the particular smell of fresh-cut hardwood practically coming through the screen itself. He had developed a catchphrase that had entered the cultural vocabulary in that gentle, effortless way that only genuinely beloved figures ever manage. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. He said it every single episode, without variation, without self-consciousness. And instead of becoming the kind of tired running joke that such repeated phrases usually become, it transformed into something else entirely. A ritual. A signal that you were exactly where you were supposed to be, that something good and real was about to happen. His skill level was genuinely extraordinary, and what made it even more extraordinary was his ability to contextualize that skill for ordinary viewers without ever diminishing it. He would execute a technique that would require most serious woodworkers years of focused practice to develop, and then explain the principles behind it in language so clear and unhurried that the technique felt learnable. Not easy, never falsely easy, but learnable. That distinction between making something seem easy and making it feel genuinely achievable through honest effort was everything. It was the distinction that separated Norm Abram from every other instructional television personality of his era. He became a genuine ambassador for American craft traditions in a way that went far beyond the television program itself. The shaker aesthetic that appeared so consistently throughout his work wasn't merely an aesthetic preference, it was a philosophical commitment. The Shakers had believed that making something well, making it with full attention and complete honesty of construction, was itself a form of devotion. That quality and simplicity weren't just design values, they were moral ones. Norm Abram embodied those beliefs so thoroughly, so naturally, that he never once needed to articulate them. You simply felt them, episode after episode, in the way he worked and the way he talked about his work. Publishers understood what was happening, and the companion books sold in numbers that surprised everyone in the industry. Tool manufacturers understood what was happening, and his endorsements carried genuine weight in the marketplace. Because viewers had come to understand instinctively that he would only put his name behind something he actually believed in. A whole ecosystem of products and publications and community organizations grew up around this one quiet man and his workshop, entirely on the strength of his credibility. And through all of it, he remained precisely who he had always been, no inflation of ego. No demands for larger budgets or more elaborate productions or greater recognition of his cultural significance. Just the work done with full commitment and complete honesty week after week after week. But here is the truth that the warmth of those years made it easy to overlook. Building something at that level of quality with that degree of personal investment for that uninterrupted length of time takes everything you have. Not just your hours, everything. And eventually, even the most extraordinary craftsman in the world has to reckon honestly with what that cost has been. What happened next surprised even the people who worked most closely alongside the show. The new Yankee workshop had run for an extraordinary length of time, more than 20 full seasons. Hundreds of individual episodes. Thousands of hours of content in which a single man had designed every project, selected every piece of lumber, and personally executed every technique that appeared on screen. Norm Abram had never been merely the host of a television program. He had been its engine, its architect, its creative conscience, and its soul simultaneously. He was, in the fullest and most literal meaning of the phrase, completely irreplaceable. And that, when you looked at it honestly, was ultimately the problem. When the show finally ended its production run, the explanation offered publicly was institutional and measured. WGBH, the Boston public television station that had produced the show from the beginning, was making decisions about programming direction. Resources were being allocated differently across the organization. The landscape of how audiences consumed instructional content had shifted in ways that were impossible to ignore. All of that was true, but underneath those carefully worded institutional explanations was something more personal, more private, and more fundamentally human. Norm Abram had given decades of himself to this work. Not just his time, not just his expertise, his identity, his craftsmanship. His patient and deeply considered approach to every single project he had ever brought before a camera. And at a certain point in any life, the question that honest people eventually have to ask themselves arrived quietly but unmistakably. What happens when continuing costs more than you have left to give? There was also a physical reality that the warm glow of fan appreciation had made it easy to avoid discussing directly. Woodworking at a professional level is physically demanding in ways that accumulate silently over decades. The standing on concrete floors for hours at a time. The repetitive motions that work the same joints and muscles year after year. The weight of tools used with precision over a working life that leaves its marks on a body the way a hand plane leaves its marks on wood, slowly, honestly, permanently. And beyond the personal and the physical, something larger was transforming the world in which the show existed. The rise of internet video was remaking instructional content from the ground up. Platforms built around video were filling rapidly with woodworking channels run by passionate craftspeople eager to share their knowledge. The singular position that the new Yankee workshop had occupied for so many years, as essentially the only serious destination on television for someone who wanted to learn this craft from a master, was quietly dissolving. The show that had been genuinely necessary to a generation of builders was entering a world where the specific need it had filled was being met in dozens of other places simultaneously. None of that diminished what the show had been. If anything, it made the ending more poignant rather than less, because the show had not failed. It had not been canceled in disgrace or driven off the air by controversy or abandoned because audiences stopped caring. It had simply, quietly, completely run its natural course. Like a piece of furniture that has been well used and deeply loved, and has given every single thing it was built to give. But that quiet ending left something unresolved in the hearts of millions of viewers. A question that lingered long after the workshop lights went out for the final time. Here is what most people never fully appreciated about the end of the new Yankee workshop. It didn't end Norm Abram. He remained a visible and respected presence in the world he had spent his life building. He continued the long and meaningful association with this old house that had first brought him to public attention, remaining connected to the program and the community surrounding it. He stayed involved in the projects and publications that had grown from his work over the decades. For the woodworking community, he remained exactly what he had always been: steady, genuine, deeply skilled, and entirely himself. Meanwhile, the workshop itself was becoming something unexpected, something almost mythological. The episodes found new life through reruns and eventually through digital distribution on streaming platforms, and something remarkable began to happen in that second life. New generations of woodworkers, people who had been children or not yet born when the show was first airing, discovered it not through Saturday morning television, but through screens they carried in their pockets. Young people who had never owned a table saw, who had grown up in a world saturated with digital content, found themselves watching Norm Abram guide a hand plane across a piece of cherry and feeling something stir in them that they hadn't expected. That deep, ancient, completely human hunger to make something real with your own hands. That pull toward the physical and the permanent in a world that had become almost entirely temporary and digital. The show's influence on American woodworking culture is genuinely difficult to measure fully. Woodworking instructors across the country, people who teach the craft at every level, will tell you consistently that students cite Norm Abram as the reason they first became interested in learning. Tool manufacturers still understand clearly that the standards he established for quality and technique shaped the expectations of an entire generation of craftspeople. And those expectations haven't disappeared. The shaker-influenced aesthetic he championed so consistently across hundreds of episodes became one of the defining styles in American furniture making for decades afterward. And its influence is still visible everywhere you look. What he built in the end was not just furniture. He built something far larger and far less tangible and far more durable than any physical object. He built a culture. A community bound together by shared values of patience and precision and honesty of construction. Values that outlasted the television program that had carried them into the world. And there is something deeply right about that outcome, something that would have felt entirely appropriate to the man himself. The best craftsmen have always understood, at some level below words, that the work matters more than the recognition. That a perfectly cut dovetail joint hidden inside a drawer that nobody will ever open twice is worth doing perfectly, because the integrity of the craft demands it, and for no other reason. Norm Abram lived those values so completely, so publicly, for so many years in front of so many people that the values themselves became the legacy, entirely independent of the show. Entirely independent of the workshop, entirely independent of any single Saturday morning ritual. The workshop is quiet now, the tools are still. But what was built inside that space, across all those seasons and all those episodes and all those ordinary Saturdays, is still standing. It is standing in the furniture that lives in homes across America, in the skills that passed from that television screen to willing and patient hands, in the simple and quietly radical idea that making something well, with full attention and complete honesty, is one of the most essentially human things a person can do in the short time they are given. And maybe that is the most truthful answer to the question that has always been waiting at the center of this story. It ended because it was complete. Because everything it was built to make had been made. Because everything it was meant to teach had been taught. There is a particular kind of grief that arrives with the end of something that never once asked for your devotion, but earned it anyway quietly over years, without ever calling attention to the earning. The new Yankee workshop never promised to be essential. It never positioned itself as culturally significant or marketed itself as unmissable. It simply showed up every Saturday with a quiet man and a workshop full of honest tools and beautiful wood, and it did its work with complete attention and genuine care, week after week, season after season, for longer than most television programs dare to dream of lasting. And somewhere along the way, without anyone planning for it or calculating it or designing it in a strategy meeting, millions of people realized that honesty and care and full attention were exactly what they had been looking for all along. In a media landscape built almost entirely around noise and spectacle and the performance of expertise, here was someone who simply knew his craft and shared it freely. And that turned out to be more than enough. It turned out to be everything. Norm Abram built more than furniture across all those years. He built a model of what it actually looks like to be genuinely excellent at something, to share that excellence with complete generosity, and to trust the work itself to carry the meaning without needing to explain it or defend it or promote it. So here is the question worth sitting with, and it is an honest one. Was the ending of the new Yankee workshop the natural and right conclusion of something that had given everything it had to give? A program that ended at the right moment with its integrity completely intact? Or do you believe that with the right support and the right vision and a producer willing to take the risk, that workshop should have kept its lights on? Leave your answer in the comments below. This community was built in that workshop and it is still listening. If this story meant something to you, if it brought back Saturday mornings, and the smell of fresh-cut wood, and the particular comfort of watching someone do something with complete mastery, share it with someone who would understand why it mattered. And subscribe for more stories about the people and programs that shaped American culture in ways we are still only beginning to fully understand.